Chapter 26. In the summer before my junior year at Placerville, Joe and I drove up to Bangor to spend a weekend with Joe's brother, who had a summer job working for the Bangor Sanitation Department. Pete McKennedy was 21, a fantastic age it seemed to me. I was struggling through the open sewer that is 17, and going to the University of Maine, where he was majoring in English. It looked like it was going to be a great weekend. On Friday night, I got drunk for the first time in my life, along with Pete and Joe and one or two of Pete's friends, and I wasn't even very hungover the next day. Pete didn't work Saturdays, so he took us up to the campus and showed us around. It's really very pretty up there in summer, although on a Saturday in July there weren't many pretty co-eds to look at. Pete told us that most of the summer students took off for Bar Harbor or Clear Lake on weekends. We were just getting ready to go back to Pete's place when he saw a guy he knew slouching down toward the steam plant parking lot. "Scrag!" he yelled. "Hey, Scrag!" Scrag was a big guy wearing paint-splattered, faded jeans and a blue work shirt. He had a drooping, sand-colored mustache and was smoking an evil-looking little black cigar that he later identified as the original Smoky Perote. It smelled like slowly burning underwear. "How's it hanging?" he asked. "Up a foot," Pete said. "This is my brother Joe and his buddy Charlie Decker," he introduced. "Scrag Simpson." "Howdy doody," Scrag said, shaking hands and dismissing us. "What you doing tonight, Peter?" "Thought the three of us might go to a movie." "Don't do that, Pete," Scrag said with a grin. "Don't do that, baby." "What's better?" Pete asked, also grinning. "Dana Collette's throwing a party at this camp her folks own out near Scudic Point. There's going to be about 40 million unattached ladies there. Bring dope." "Does Larry Moeller have any grass?" Pete asked. "Last I knew, he had a shitload. Foreign, domestic, local, everything but filter tips." Pete nodded. "We'll be there, unless the creek rises." Scrag nodded and waved a hand as he prepared to resume his version of that ever-popular form of campus locomotion, the undergraduate slouch. "Meet you," he said to Joe and me. We went down to see Jerry Moeller, who Pete said was the biggest dope dealer in the Orono Old Town Stillwater Triangle. I kept my cool about it, as if I were one of the original Placerville Jones men, but privately I was excited and pretty apprehensive. As I remember it, I sort of expected to see Jerry sitting naked on the john with a piece of rubber flex tied off below his elbow and a hypo dangling from the big forearm vein, and watching the rise and fall of ancient Atlantis in his navel. He had a small apartment in Old Town, which borders the campus on one side. Old Town is a small city with three distinctions: its paper mill, its canoe factory, and 12 of the roughest honky-tonks in this great smiling country. It also has an encampment of real reservation Indians, and most of them look at you as if wondering how much hair you might have growing out of your asshole and whether or not it would be worth scalping. Jerry turned out to be not an ominous Jones man type, holding court amid the reek of incense and Ravi Shankar music, but a small guy with a constant wedge of lemon grin. He was fully clothed and in his right mind. His only ornament was a bright yellow button, which bore the message, "Goldilocks loved it." Instead of Ravi and his incredible boinging sitar, he had a large collection of bluegrass music. When I saw his Greenbrier Boys albums, I asked him if he'd ever heard the Tar Brothers. I've always been a country and bluegrass nut. After that, we were off. Pete and Joe just sat around looking bored until Jerry produced what looked like a small cigarette wrapped in brown paper. "You want to light it?" he asked Pete. Pete lit it. The smell was pungent, almost tart, and very pleasant. He drew it deep, held the smoke, and passed the J on to Joe, who coughed most of it out. Jerry turned back to me. "You ever heard the Clinch Mountain Boys?" I shook my head. "Heard of them, though." "You gotta listen to this," he said. "Boy, is it horny." He put an LP with a weird label on the stereo. The J came around to me. "You smoke cigarettes?" Jerry asked me paternally. I shook my head. "Then draw slow or you'll lose it." I drew slow. The smoke was sweet, rather heavy, acrid, dry. I held my breath and passed the J on to Jerry. The Clinch Mountain Boys started in on Blue Ridge Breakdown. Half an hour later, we had progressed through 2 more joints and were listening to Flat and Scruggs charge through a little number called Rushin' Around. I was about ready to ask when I should start feeling stoned when I realized I could actually visualize the banjo chords in my mind They were bright, like long steel threads, and shuttling back and forth like looms. They were moving rapidly, but I could follow them if I concentrated deeply. I tried to tell Joe about it, but he only looked at me in a puzzled, fuzzy way. We both laughed. Pete was looking at a picture of Niagara Falls on the wall very closely. We ended up sticking around until almost 5 o'clock, and when we left, I was wrecked out of my mind. Pete bought an ounce of grass from Jerry, and we took off for Schoodic. Jerry stood in the doorway of his apartment and waved goodbye and yelled for me to come back and bring some of my records. That's the last really happy time I can remember. It was a long drive down to the coast. All three of us were still very high, and although Pete had no trouble driving, none of us could seem to talk without getting the giggles. I remember asking Pete once what this Dana Collette who was throwing the party looked like, and he just leered. That made me laugh until I thought my stomach was going to explode. I could still hear bluegrass playing in my head. Pete had been to a party out there in the spring, and we only took one wrong turn finding it. It was at the end of a narrow mile of gravel marked Private Road. You could hear the heavy bass signature of the music a quarter mile from the cabin. There were so many cars stacked up that we had to walk from just about that point. Pete parked and we got out. I was starting to feel unsure of myself and self-conscious again. Partly the residue of the pot and partly just me. Worried about how young and stupid I would probably look to all these college people. Jerry Moeller had to be 1 in 100. I decided I would just stick close to Joe and keep my mouth closed. As it turned out, I could have saved the worry. The place was packed to the rafters with what seemed like 1,000,000 people. Every one of them drunk, stoned, or both. The smell of marijuana hung on the air like a heavy mist, along with wine and hot bods. The place was a babble of conversation, loud rock music, and laughter. There were 2 lights dangling from the ceiling, one red, one blue. That rounds off the first impression the place gave me. It was like the fun house at Old Orchard Beach. Scragg waved at us from across the room. "Pete!" Someone squealed almost in my ear. I jerked and almost swallowed my tongue. It was a short, almost pretty girl with bleached hair and the shortest dress I have ever seen. It was a bright fluorescent orange that looked almost alive in the weird lighting. "Hi, Dana," Pete shouted over the noise. "This is my brother Joe and one of his buddies, Charlie Decker." She said hi to both of us. "Isn't it a great party?" she asked me. When she moved, the hem of her dress swirled around the lace bottoms of her panties. I said it was a great party. "Did you bring any goodies, Pete?" Pete grinned and held up his baggie of weed. Her eyes sparkled. She was standing next to me, her hip pressed casually against mine. I could feel her bare thigh. I began to get as horny as a bull moose. "Bring it over here," she said. We found a relatively unoccupied corner behind one of the stereo speakers, and Dana produced a huge scrolled water pipe from a low bookshelf that was fairly groaning with Hesse, Tolkien, and Reader's Digest condensed books. The latter belonged to the parents, I assumed. We toked up. The grass was much smoother in the water pipe, and I could hold the smoke better. I began to get very high indeed. My head was filling up with helium. People came and went. Introductions, which I promptly forgot, were made. The thing that I liked best about the introductions was that every time a stray wandered by, Dana would bounce up to grab him or her, and when she did, I could look straight up her dress to where the heavenly home was sheathed in the gauziest of blue nylon. People changed records. I watched them come and go, some of them undoubtedly talking of Michelangelo or Ted Kennedy or Kurt Vonnegut. A woman asked me if I had read Susan Brownmiller's Women Rapists. I said no. She told me it was very tight. She crossed her fingers in front of her eyes to show me how tight it was, and then wandered off. I watched the fluorescent poster on the far wall, which showed a guy in a T-shirt sitting in front of a TV. The guy's eyeballs were slowly dripping down his cheeks, and there was a big cheese-eating grin on his face. The poster said, "Shit, Friday night and I'm stoned again." I watched Dana cross and uncross her legs. A few filaments of pubic hair, 9 shades darker than the bleach job, had strayed out of the lacy leg bands. I don't think I have ever been that horny. I doubt if I will ever be that horny again. I had an organ which felt large enough and long enough to pole vault on. I began to wonder if the male sex organ can explode. She turned to me and suddenly whispered in my ear. My stomach heated up 20 degrees instantly, as if I had been eating chili. A moment before, she had been talking to Pete and to some joker I remembered being non-introduced to. Then she was whispering in my ear, her breath tickling the dark channel. "Go on out the back door," she said. "There." She pointed. It was hard to comprehend, so I just followed her finger. Yes, there was the door. The door was real, and the door was earnest. It had one hell of a knob on it. I chuckled, convinced that I had just thought a particularly witty thought. She laughed lightly in my ear and said, "You've been looking up my dress all night. What does that mean?" And before I could say anything, she kissed my cheek softly and gave me a little shove to get me going. I looked around for Joe, but I didn't see him anyplace. Sorry, Joe. I got up and heard both my knees pop. My legs were stiff from sitting in the same position so long. I had an urge to untuck my shirt and cover up the huge bulge in my jeans. I had an urge to tiptoe across the room. I had an urge to cackle wildly and announce to the general attendance that Charles Everett Decker earnestly believed that he was about to get screwed, that, to drop a bad pun, Charles Everett Decker was about to rip off his maiden piece. I didn't do any of those things. I went out the back door. I was so stoned and so horny that I almost fell 20 feet to the tiny white shingle of beach that was down below. The back of the cabin overlooked a sudden rocky drop to a postage stamp inlet. A flight of weather-washed steps led down. I walked carefully, holding on to the railing. My feet felt 1,000 miles away. The music sounded distant on this side, blending and almost being covered by the rhythmic sound of the waves. There was a slip of a moon and a ghost of a breeze. The scene was so frozenly beautiful that for a moment I thought I had walked into a black-and-white picture postcard. The cabin behind and above was only a dim blur. The trees climbed on both sides, pines and spruces that sloped off to naked rock headland, twin spurs of it, which cupped the crescent-shaped beach where the waves licked. Straight ahead was the Atlantic, pinpointed with uncertain nets of light from the moon. I could see the faintest curve of an island far out to the left, and wondered who walked there that night besides the wind. It was a lonesome thought, and it made me shiver a little. I slipped off my shoes and waited for her. I don't know how long it was before she came. I didn't have any wristwatch and was too stoned to be able to judge in any case. And after a little while, unease began to creep in. Something about the shadow of trees on the wet, packed sand and the sound of the wind. Maybe the ocean itself, a big thing, a mean mother-humper full of unseen life and all those little pricks of light. Maybe the cold feel of the sand under my bare feet. Maybe none of those things, maybe all of them and more. But by the time she put her hand on my shoulder, I had lost my erection. Wyatt Earp striding into the OK Corral with no six-gun. She turned me around, stood on tiptoe, kissed me. I could feel the warmth of her thighs, but now it was nothing special to me. "I saw you looking at me," is what she said. "Are you nice? Can you be nice?" "I can try," I told her, feeling a little absurd. I touched her breasts, and she held me close. But my erection was still gone. "Don't tell Pete," she said, taking me by the hand. "He'd kill me. We've got a kind of a thing." She led me underneath the back steps, where the grass was cool and matted with aromatic pine needles. The shadows made cold Venetian blinds on her body as she slipped out of her dress. "This is so crazy," she said, and she sounded excited. Then we were rolling together, and my shirt was off. She was working at the snap on the front of my jeans, but my cock was still on coffee break. She touched me, sliding her hand inside my underpants, and the muscles down there jerked, not in pleasure or in revulsion, but in a kind of terror. Her hand felt like rubber, cold and impersonal and antiseptic. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, come on, come on." I tried to think of something sexy, anything sexy. Looking up Darlene Andreessen's skirt in study hall and her knowing it and letting me. Maynard Quinn's pack of dirty French playing cards. I thought of Sandy Cross in sexy black underwear, and that started to move something around down there. And then, of all things, to come cruising out of my imagination, I saw my father with his hunting knife talking about the Cherokee nose job. "The what?" Corky Harold asked. I explained the Cherokee nose job. "Oh," Corky said. I went on. "That did it. Everything collapsed into noodledom again. And after that, there was nothing. And nothing. And nothing. My jeans had joined my shirt. My underpants were somewhere down around my ankles. She was quivering underneath me. I could feel her like the plucked string of a musical instrument. I reached down and took hold of my penis and shook it as if to ask what was wrong with it. But Mr. Penis wasn't talking. I let my hand wander around to the warm junction of her thighs. I could feel her pubic hair, a little kinky, shockingly like my own. I slid an exploratory finger into her, thinking, this is the place. This is the place men like my father joke about on hunting trips and in barber shops. Men kill for this. Force it open, steal it, or bludgeon it, take it, or leave it. Where is it? Dana whispered in a high, breathless voice. Where is it? Where? So I tried. But it was like that old joke about the guy that tried to jam a marshmallow into the piggy bank. Nothing. And all the time I could hear the soft sound of the ocean grounding on the beach, like the soundtrack of a sappy movie. Then I rolled off. I'm sorry. My voice was shockingly loud, rasping. I could hear her sigh. It was a short sound, an irritated sound. All right, she said. It happens. Not to me, I said, as if this was the first time in several thousand sexual encounters that my equipment had malfunctioned. Dimly I could hear Mick Jagger and the Stones shouting out, hot stuff, one of life's little ironies. I still felt wrecked, but it was a cold feeling, depthless. The cold certainty that I was queer crept over me like rising water. I had read someplace that you didn't have to have any overt homosexual experience to be queer. You could just be that way and never know it until the queen in your closet leaped out at you like Norman Bates's mom in Psycho, a grotesque mugger prancing and mincing in Mommy's makeup and Mommy's shoes. It's just as well, she said. Pete, look, I'm sorry. She smiled, but it looked manufactured. I've wondered since if it was or not. I'd like to believe it was a real smile. It's the dope. I bet you're a hell of a lover when things are right. Fuck, I said, and shivered at the dead sound in my own voice. No, she sat up. I'm going back in. Wait until I'm gone a while before you come up. I wanted to tell her to wait, to let me try it again, but I knew I couldn't, not if all the seas dried up and the moon turned to zinc oxide. She zipped into her dress and was gone, leaving me there under the steps. The moon watched me closely, perhaps to see if I might cry. I didn't. After a little while, I got my clothes straightened around and most of last fall's leaves brushed off me. Then I went back upstairs. Pete and Dana were gone. Joe was over in a corner making out with a really stunning girl who had her hands in his mop of blonde hair. I sat down and waited for the party to be over. Eventually it was. By the time the three of us got back to Bangor, Dawn had already pulled most of her tricks out of her bag, and a red edge of sun was peering down at us from beneath the smokestacks of beautiful downtown Brewer. None of us had much to say. I felt tired and grainy and not able to tell how much damage had been done to me. I had a leaden feeling that it was more than I really needed. We went upstairs, and I fell into the tiny daybed in the living room. The last thing I saw before I went to sleep was bars of sunlight falling through the Venetian blinds and onto the small throw rug by the radiator. I dreamed about the creaking thing. It was almost the same as when I was small. I in my bed, the moving shadows of the tree outside on the ceiling, the steady, sinister sound. Only this time, the sound kept getting closer and closer until the door of the bedroom burst open with an awful crack like the sound of doom. It was my father. My mother was in his arms. Her nose had been slit wide open, and blood streamed down her cheeks like war paint. You want her? He said. Here, take her, you worthless good-for-nothing. Take her. He threw her on the bed beside me, and I saw that she was dead, and that's when I woke up screaming. With an erection.